At 2:17 in the morning on August 21st, 1942, Private Albert Schmid crouched behind a wall of sandbags and coconut logs on the west bank of Alligator Creek, his hands gripping the trigger assembly of a .30 caliber M1917 water-cooled machine gun. At 20 years old, he was an ordinary Philadelphia steelworker who had enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor, carrying nothing more than basic training and the hope of someday marrying his girlfriend back home. The same girl he'd bought an engagement ring for with his enlistment bonus. The jungle around him buzzed with insects and the distant sound of waves, but Schmid wasn't listening to nature. He was watching the sandbar 200 yards away, where intelligence reports said a veteran Japanese detachment, 917 battle-hardened soldiers who had just landed under cover of darkness, was preparing to overrun the Marine perimeter and recapture Henderson Field. His squad leader, Corporal Leroy Diamond, whispered that the enemy would come in waves, screaming, with bayonets fixed and grenades ready. His gunner, Private Johnny Rivers, checked the ammunition belt one more time and muttered that their machine gun was all that stood between the Japanese and the airfield that could turn the tide of the Pacific War. The Marines had been told that disciplined firepower and steady nerves could stop even a banzai charge, that American industrial might and superior tactics would always prevail over fanatical courage. They believed that as long as they could see the enemy coming, they could cut them down. At exactly 2:03, Japanese flares arced overhead, painting the night in sickly yellow light, and the screaming began. Rivers opened fire, his machine gun spitting death across the sandbar as hundreds of Japanese soldiers charged through the surf. Then a grenade exploded 3 feet from Schmid's position, and everything went black. But somehow, the gun never stopped firing. The radio crackled to life in the Schmid household on Germantown Avenue at 7:32 on the morning of December 8, 1941. Albert Andrew Schmid was stirring sugar into his coffee when the announcer's voice cut through the static, reporting that Japanese aircraft had attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, sinking multiple battleships and killing thousands of servicemen. The 20-year-old steelworker apprentice set down his spoon and listened as President Roosevelt's voice filled the kitchen, declaring that December 7th would live in infamy. Schmid's mother, Helen, emerged from the back bedroom in her housecoat, asking what all the commotion was about, but Albert was already calculating. The war that had been raging across Europe and Asia for 2 years had finally reached America, and every able-bodied man would be needed. By 9:15 that same morning, Schmid was walking down Broad Street toward the Marine Corps recruiting station, his work boots echoing against wet pavement. He had skipped his shift at the Diston Saw Works without calling in, knowing that steel production would continue with or without him, but that his country needed him more than the factory floor did. The recruiting station was already crowded with young men, some still in their work clothes, others dressed in their Sunday best, all carrying the same grim determination that had seized Philadelphia overnight. Staff Sergeant Murphy, a weathered veteran with ribbons from the last war, looked up from his paperwork as Schmid approached the desk and stated his intention to enlist in the United States Marine Corps Reserve. The next morning, December 9th, Schmid signed his name to the enlistment papers, raised his right hand, and swore an oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. He was issued a service number, given a physical examination, and told to report for transportation to Marine Corps Recruit Depot, Parris Island, South Carolina, in 3 weeks. With his enlistment bonus of $50, he walked to Bailey Banks and Biddle Jewelers on Chestnut Street and purchased a small diamond engagement ring for his girlfriend, Ruth Hartley, whom he had been courting since 1939. The ring cost $42.50, leaving him with $7.50 to last until his first military paycheck. Parris Island in January 1942 was a crucible of sand fleas, screaming drill instructors, and recruits who had never been farther from home than the next county. Schmid learned to march in formation, fire the M1903 Springfield rifle, and endure the verbal assault of drill instructor Gunnery Sergeant Williams, who informed the platoon daily that they were the sorriest collection of civilians he had ever seen, and that the Japanese would eat them alive unless they became Marines. The training was relentless. Reveille at 4:30, calisthenics until dawn, rifle drill until noon, field exercises until dark, and lights out at 2100 hours. Schmid excelled at marksmanship, consistently scoring expert with both the Springfield and the M1911 pistol, but struggled with the physical demands of forced marches carrying full field equipment. After 8 weeks of recruit training, Schmid was transferred to Marine Corps Base New River, North Carolina, for advanced infantry training. The base, carved out of swampland and pine forests, specialized in preparing Marines for amphibious warfare in the Pacific Theater. He was assigned to weapons training, specifically the .30 caliber M1917 water-cooled machine gun, a weapon that weighed 41 pounds without its tripod and could fire up to 600 rounds per minute when properly maintained. The gun required a three-man crew, a gunner, an assistant gunner, and an ammunition bearer, and Schmid learned each position thoroughly. The water-cooled barrel allowed sustained fire for extended periods without overheating, making it ideal for defensive positions, but the weapon was heavy and cumbersome, requiring careful positioning and constant maintenance. During field exercises in the North Carolina wilderness, Schmid's instructors emphasized the importance of interlocking fields of fire, the necessity of precise range estimation, and the critical nature of ammunition conservation. Live fire exercises used the same belt-fed ammunition he would encounter in combat, .30 caliber rounds loaded in 250 round belts, with armor-piercing and ball ammunition mixed according to tactical requirements. He learned to disassemble and reassemble the weapon blindfolded, to clear jams under pressure, and to calculate firing solutions for targets at varying distances and elevations. In May 1942, orders arrived assigning Schmid to H Company, 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, 1st Marine Division. The unit was forming up for overseas deployment, destination classified, but rumored to be somewhere in the Pacific. He was designated as assistant gunner in the 11th Machine Gun Squad, working with gunner Johnny Rivers and section leader Corporal Leroy Diamond. Rivers was a quiet farm boy from Iowa who could strip a machine gun faster than anyone in the company, while Diamond was a career Marine with 3 years of service and a reputation for keeping his men alive through attention to detail and aggressive training. The 1st Marine Division assembled at Norfolk Naval Base in Virginia during June 1942, loading aboard transport ships that would carry them across the Pacific Ocean. Schmid's transport, the USS George F. Elliott, was a converted passenger liner crammed with Marines, equipment, and supplies for an extended campaign. The ship's holds contained everything from ammunition and rations to construction equipment and medical supplies, suggesting a major operation requiring sustained ground combat. During the 3-week voyage, Marines conducted weapons maintenance, physical training, and tactical briefings in the cramped quarters below decks. Intelligence briefings revealed their destination: Guadalcanal, a jungle-covered island in the Solomon Chain, where Japanese forces were constructing an airfield that could threaten Allied shipping lanes and support further enemy advances toward Australia. The mission was straightforward: conduct an amphibious assault, capture the airfield, and hold it against counterattack. Maps showed dense tropical jungle, steep ridges, and limited beach areas suitable for landing operations. The Japanese garrison was estimated at approximately 2,000 troops, including construction workers and combat units. On August 7, 1942, the 1st Marine Division conducted the first major Allied amphibious assault in the Pacific Theater, landing on Guadalcanal's northern beaches under cover of naval gunfire. Schmid waded ashore carrying his portion of the machine gun equipment, following Diamond and Rivers through knee-deep surf toward a beach littered with palm fronds and abandoned Japanese construction materials. The airfield, almost complete and immediately designated Henderson Field after a Marine aviator killed at Midway, was captured without significant resistance. But intelligence estimates had been wrong. The Japanese had withdrawn into the jungle, and within hours of the landing, enemy bombers appeared overhead, beginning a campaign that would test every Marine's resolve. 2 weeks after the initial landing, the Marines had transformed Henderson Field from a partially completed Japanese construction project into a functioning airbase, but the perimeter remained vulnerable to enemy infiltration through the dense jungle that pressed against their defensive positions. On the evening of August 20th, 1942, intelligence reports indicated significant Japanese movement east of the Ilu River, which Marines had designated Alligator Creek due to the crocodiles that inhabited its brackish waters. Colonel Clifton Cates, commanding the 1st Marines, positioned his 2nd Battalion along the west bank of the creek, with machine gun teams covering the sandbar where the waterway emptied into Iron Bottom Sound. Schmid's squad occupied a position 50 yards south of the river mouth, their .30 caliber M1917 water-cooled machine gun emplaced behind a breastwork of sandbags filled with coral sand and reinforced with coconut logs dragged from the beach. The gun was positioned to deliver enfilade fire across the sandbar, with additional coverage extending inland along likely avenues of approach through the coconut plantation that stretched eastward from the Marine perimeter. Rivers had spent the afternoon adjusting the headspace and timing mechanism. ensuring the weapon would function reliably during sustained fire, while Diamond coordinated fields of fire with adjacent positions and established ammunition resupply procedures. The intelligence estimates that reached frontline units indicated a Japanese force of unknown size had landed at Taivu Point, 22 miles east of Henderson Field, and was advancing westward with the apparent intention of recapturing the airfield. Radio intercepts suggested the enemy force included veteran troops from recent campaigns, possibly including elements that had participated in the conquest of Singapore or the Philippines. Marine patrols had encountered advanced scouts throughout the day, brief firefights that ended with enemy withdrawal deeper into the jungle, leaving behind equipment that suggested a larger force was preparing for a coordinated assault. At 2100 hours on August 20th, all Marine units received orders to maintain maximum alertness throughout the night, with 50% of personnel on watch at any given time and strict noise discipline in effect. Schmid drew the first watch, positioning himself behind the machine gun, while Rivers attempted to sleep in the shallow fighting hole they had excavated earlier that day. Diamond moved between positions, checking ammunition supplies and coordinating with the platoon command post via field telephone. The night air carried the sounds of the jungle, insects, fruit bats, and the occasional splash of crocodiles moving through the creek, but experienced Marines had learned to distinguish between natural sounds and human movement. At approximately midnight, listening posts forward of the main defensive line reported movement in the coconut plantation, followed by the sound of metal equipment clanking against tree trunks and whispered commands in Japanese. Diamond returned to the machine gun position, bringing additional ammunition belts and confirming that supporting fires from the 37mm anti-tank guns positioned behind the main line were prepared to deliver canister rounds on call. The waiting became oppressive, with every sound magnified by tension, and the knowledge that Japanese night attacks typically began with infiltration tactics designed to achieve surprise and maximum psychological impact. At 1:57 on the morning of August 21st, Japanese flares burst overhead, casting eerie shadows across the sandbar and illuminating figures moving through the coconut trees. The flares burned with magnesium intensity, creating harsh white light that eliminated night vision and made target identification difficult. Within seconds of the illumination, the distinctive sound of Japanese voices shouting "Banzai" echoed across the creek, followed by the rapid footsteps of men running across coral sand. Rivers immediately swung the machine gun toward the sound, his hand steady on the traversing and elevating mechanism as he acquired targets among the charging figures. The initial Japanese assault consisted of approximately 200 men from the Ichiki detachment, veteran soldiers who had participated in campaigns across Southeast Asia and the Dutch East Indies. They advanced in loose formation across the sandbar, some carrying rifles with fixed bayonets, others armed with light machine guns and grenade dischargers. The assault was preceded by mortar fire that landed short of the Marine positions, followed by concentrated small arms fire from positions along the east bank of the creek. Japanese tactics emphasized speed and shock action, designed to overwhelm defensive positions through aggressive frontal assault, supported by suppressive fire. Rivers opened fire at a range of approximately 150 yards, his first burst catching the leading elements of the assault as they reached the center of the sandbar. The .30 caliber rounds, fired at a cyclic rate of 450 rounds per minute, created an immediate casualty zone that halted the forward momentum of the attack. The water-cooled barrel allowed sustained fire without the overheating problems that plagued air-cooled weapons, and Rivers maintained continuous fire as Japanese soldiers attempted to advance through the beaten zone. The sound of the machine gun was distinctive, a rapid hammering that could be heard above the rifle fire and shouting that characterized the night battle. Japanese return fire concentrated on the machine gun position, with rifle bullets striking the sandbags and coconut logs, while mortar rounds began landing with increasing accuracy behind the Marine line. Several enemy soldiers made it across the sandbar and reached the west bank of the creek, where they engaged Marine riflemen in close combat with bayonets and grenades. The fighting was chaotic, with muzzle flashes illuminating brief glimpses of struggling figures and the screams of wounded men punctuating the continuous gunfire. Diamond coordinated defensive fires via field telephone, calling for illumination rounds from the destroyers offshore and requesting immediate support from the battalion reserve. At approximately 2:30, during the height of the assault, a Japanese rifle bullet struck Rivers in the chest, knocking him backward from the gun. Even as he fell, his finger remained on the trigger, sending another 200 rounds downrange before Diamond could reach the weapon and cease fire. Schmid immediately moved to the gun position, taking over the gunner's role while Diamond provided target direction and ammunition handling. The machine gun had become the focal point of the Japanese attack, with enemy soldiers concentrating their fire on the position while attempting to advance close enough to eliminate the crew with grenades and small arms. The battle continued for another 3 hours, with successive waves of Japanese attackers crossing the sandbar, only to be cut down by interlocking machine gun and rifle fire. The 37th millimeter guns contributed significantly to the defense, firing canister rounds that created wide casualty zones among attacking troops. By dawn, the sandbar was littered with Japanese dead, and the assault had been decisively repelled, but the cost to both sides had been significant, with Rivers among the Marine casualties who had paid the price for holding the perimeter around Henderson Field. The Japanese assault intensified as the third wave of attackers approached the Marine defensive line, this time supported by concentrated mortar fire that walked methodically across the west bank of Alligator Creek. Schmid had been firing the machine gun for nearly an hour since Rivers fell, his hands cramped from gripping the spade handles, and his shoulders aching from absorbing the weapon's recoil. The barrel jacket was almost too hot to touch despite the water cooling system, and steam rose from the condensing can as heated water vapor escaped through the overflow tube. Diamond crouched beside him, feeding ammunition belts and calling out target directions as Japanese soldiers attempted to flank the position through the coconut plantation. At 3:47 in the morning, enemy mortar rounds began landing with increasing accuracy around the machine gun position, indicating that Japanese forward observers had identified the weapon as a priority target. The first round landed 15 yards behind the position, showering the Marines with coral fragments and palm fronds. The second landed 10 yards to the left, close enough that the concussion knocked loose equipment from the sandbag parapet. Diamond grabbed the field telephone and called for counter-battery fire from the destroyers offshore, requesting immediate suppression of the enemy mortars that were ranging in on their position with deadly precision. Schmid traversed the machine gun to engage a group of Japanese soldiers who had advanced to within 75 yards of the Marine line, moving through the coconut trees in short rushes, while their comrades provided covering fire from positions along the east bank of the creek. The cyclic rate of fire had decreased slightly due to the heat buildup in the barrel, but the weapon continued to function reliably, sending .30 caliber rounds into the advancing infantry with devastating effect. The Japanese soldiers were visible in brief glimpses as they moved from tree to tree, their dark uniforms blending with the shadows cast by the intermittent illumination from flares and muzzle flashes. The third mortar round landed 8 yards in front of the position, and Schmid felt fragments whistle past his helmet as coral sand rained down on the machine gun. Diamond was shouting coordinates into the field telephone when the fourth round landed directly behind them, close enough that the blast lifted both Marines off the ground and slammed them back down onto the coral sand. The concussion was deafening, temporarily eliminating all sound except for a high-pitched ringing that seemed to originate inside Schmid's skull. When he tried to rise, his hands came away from his face covered with blood, and he realized he could not see anything except darkness and swirling red spots. Diamond was calling his name, but the voice seemed to come from a great distance, muffled and distorted as if heard through water. Schmid reached for the machine gun, his hands finding the familiar spade handles by touch, and tried to focus on the sounds of the battle that continued around them. Japanese voices were closer now, shouting commands and battle cries as they advanced across the sandbar and through the plantation. The sound of rifle fire was continuous, punctuated by the distinctive crack of Japanese Arisaka rifles and the deeper boom of Marine Garand rifles responding from positions along the defensive line. The blast that had blinded Schmid had also wounded Diamond, who was bleeding from multiple fragment wounds in his arms and legs, but the section leader remained conscious and functional. Realizing that Schmid could no longer see to aim the weapon effectively, Diamond positioned himself where he could observe the approaching enemy and began calling out firing directions in a loud, clear voice that cut through the noise of battle. The system was primitive but effective. Diamond would identify targets by their distance and direction relative to prominent terrain features, then guide Schmid's fire by observing the impact of the rounds and making corrections. Target front, 100 yards, left edge of the sandbar, Diamond shouted, his voice hoarse from breathing coral dust and gunpowder smoke. Fire 10 rounds, then traverse right 20 degrees. Schmid pressed the trigger and felt the familiar vibration of the weapon cycling, counting the rounds as they fired, and then adjusting his aim according to Diamond's instructions. The technique required absolute trust between the two Marines, with Diamond serving as Schmid's eyes while Schmid provided the firepower necessary to stop the advancing Japanese infantry. The partnership functioned with deadly efficiency despite Schmid's blindness, as Diamond had an excellent understanding of the weapon's capabilities and limitations. He could judge the trajectory of the rounds by their sound and observe their impact even in the poor visibility conditions created by smoke and intermittent illumination. When Japanese soldiers attempted to advance across open ground, Diamond would direct Schmid to fire in sustained bursts that created beaten zones impossible to cross. When the enemy took cover behind trees or coral outcroppings, he would call for single shots aimed at likely positions where soldiers might attempt to advance. At 4:15, a group of approximately 30 Japanese soldiers attempted a coordinated assault on the machine gun position, advancing in bounds while their comrades provided suppressive fire from multiple directions. Diamond identified the threat and directed Schmid to traverse the weapon in a wide arc, firing continuously to create an impenetrable barrier of 30 caliber rounds. The water-cooled barrel allowed this type of sustained fire without the weapon overheating, and the Japanese assault collapsed under the weight of concentrated machine gun fire, supplemented by rifle fire from adjacent Marine positions. The ammunition supply was becoming critical, with only 3 full belts remaining in the position, and no opportunity for resupply while the battle continued. Diamond rationed the remaining rounds carefully, directing Schmid to fire only when targets presented clear opportunities for multiple casualties. The Japanese seemed to recognize that the machine gun was operating with reduced effectiveness, and they began probing the flanks of the position more aggressively, forcing Diamond to divide his attention between target identification and local security. Japanese infiltration tactics became more sophisticated as the night progressed, with small groups attempting to work their way through the coconut plantation to attack the machine gun position from unexpected angles. Diamond detected these movements by sound and occasional glimpses of movement, directing Schmid to engage targets that were sometimes only 50 yards away. The close-range engagements were particularly challenging because the machine gun's minimum range made it difficult to depress the barrel sufficiently to engage targets in nearby shell craters and fighting holes. At 5:30, just as the eastern horizon began to show the first hint of dawn, the Japanese launched their final coordinated assault on the Marine perimeter. This attack involved approximately 150 soldiers advancing simultaneously across multiple approaches, with supporting fire from all remaining enemy weapons. Diamond could see that the assault was larger and more determined than previous attempts, and he directed Schmid to concentrate fire on the main body of attackers crossing the sandbar, while other Marine positions engaged the flanking elements. The machine gun had been firing almost continuously for 4 hours, consuming over 2,000 rounds of 30 caliber ammunition and accounting for an estimated 125 Japanese casualties. The weapon was operating at the limits of its mechanical tolerance, with the barrel jacket too hot to touch and the water in the cooling system boiling furiously. Despite these conditions, the gun continued to function reliably, testament to both the quality of its engineering and the maintenance skills of its crew. As the sun rose over Guadalcanal on the morning of August 21, 1942, the Japanese assault finally collapsed under the concentrated fire of the Marine defensive line. The sandbar and coconut plantation were littered with enemy dead, and the few surviving members of the Ichiki detachment were retreating eastward toward their original landing site. Schmid continued to man the machine gun despite his blindness, guided by Diamond's voice and sustained by the knowledge that their position had held against overwhelming odds and superior numbers. The first light of dawn revealed the full scope of the carnage that stretched across the sandbar and coconut plantation east of Alligator Creek. Japanese bodies lay scattered in groups where concentrated machine gun fire had caught them crossing open ground, with individual corpses marking the furthest points of advance toward the Marine defensive line. The tropical air already carried the sickly sweet smell of death, a combination of blood, cordite, and the rapid decomposition that began within hours in the humid climate of Guadalcanal. Marine officers moved cautiously along the perimeter, assessing casualties and reorganizing defensive positions while maintaining vigilance against possible counterattack. Captain William Hawkins, commanding H Company, approached Schmid's position at 6:15 in the morning, accompanied by a Navy corpsman and 2 riflemen detailed as stretcher bearers. The machine gun emplacement showed the effects of the night's fighting, with sandbags torn open by fragments, and the coconut log revetment splintered by direct hits from enemy mortars. Schmid remained at his weapon, hands still gripping the spade handles despite Diamond's attempts to convince him that the immediate threat had passed. Blood from his facial wounds had dried in dark streaks down his cheeks, and his eyes stared sightlessly toward the creek where Japanese voices had shouted throughout the night. The corpsman, hospital apprentice First Class Robert Chen, conducted a preliminary examination of Schmid's injuries, while Diamond provided a detailed account of the night's action to Captain Hawkins. The blast that had blinded Schmid had driven metal fragments and coral particles into his face and eyes, causing severe lacerations and what appeared to be permanent damage to his vision. Chen applied field dressings to the most serious wounds and administered a morphine injection to reduce pain and shock, but recommended immediate evacuation to the aid station for more comprehensive treatment by a Navy surgeon. Diamond's own wounds were less severe but numerous, consisting of fragment injuries to his arms, legs, and torso that had not incapacitated him during the fighting. The section leader had lost significant amounts of blood and was showing signs of exhaustion from the prolonged combat, but he insisted on remaining with his weapon until a replacement crew could be assigned to the position. His account of the night's action emphasized Schmid's continued effectiveness as a gunner even after losing his sight, crediting him with at least 75 confirmed enemy casualties during the 4-hour engagement. Captain Hawkins ordered the immediate evacuation of both Marines to the battalion aid station, but Schmid resisted leaving his position until he could be assured that adequate defensive fires would be maintained along the creek line. The captain assigned a fresh machine gun crew from the company reserve, supervised the transfer of remaining ammunition, and personally briefed the replacement gunner on the fields of fire that had proven most effective during the night battle. Only after these arrangements were completed would Schmid consent to evacuation, assisted by the corpsman and one of the stretcher bearers. The battalion aid station occupied a cluster of tents approximately 800 yards behind the front lines, positioned near the edge of Henderson Field, where Navy transport aircraft could evacuate serious casualties to rear area hospitals. Lieutenant Commander James Morrison, the battalion's surgeon, examined Schmid's injuries under improved lighting conditions and confirmed that the damage to his eyes was extensive and likely permanent. Fragments had penetrated both eyes, causing severe trauma to the corneas and retinas, while additional injuries to his face would require reconstructive surgery to minimize scarring and restore normal function. Morrison's initial treatment focused on cleaning and debriding the wounds, removing accessible fragments, and preventing infection through the application of sulfa powder and sterile dressings. The extent of Schmid's injuries required evacuation to a fully equipped hospital, but transport aircraft were not immediately available due to ongoing Japanese air attacks on Henderson Field. The wounded Marine would have to remain at the aid station until medical evacuation could be arranged, probably within 24 to 48 hours, depending on tactical conditions. While medical personnel treated the wounded, Marine units began the grim task of clearing the battlefield and assessing enemy casualties. Patrols moved carefully through the coconut plantation, checking Japanese bodies for intelligence materials and ensuring that no wounded enemy soldiers remained alive to threaten Marine positions. The count of enemy dead exceeded initial estimates, with 774 Japanese bodies eventually identified and buried in mass graves east of the creek. Equipment recovered from the battlefield included rifles, machine guns, mortars, and personal items that provided valuable intelligence about enemy units and their capabilities. Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Cresswell, commanding 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, ordered a limited counterattack at 1000 hours to ensure that no surviving Japanese forces remained in positions where they could threaten the Marine perimeter. The operation involved crossing Alligator Creek upstream from the battle site, then advancing eastward through the coconut plantation to establish contact with any enemy survivors. The battalion encountered scattered resistance from small groups of wounded Japanese soldiers, but organized enemy opposition had collapsed with the failure of the night attack. The counterattack revealed the extent to which Marine defensive fires had devastated the Ichiki detachment, with evidence of concentrated casualties in areas where machine guns had established beaten zones across likely avenues of approach. The .30 caliber M1917 water-cooled machine guns had proven particularly effective, accounting for the majority of enemy casualties through sustained, accurate fire that enemy infantry could not penetrate or suppress. The effectiveness of these weapons validated Marine Corps doctrine that emphasized the importance of properly sighted automatic weapons in defensive operations. At noon, 3 M3 Stuart light tanks from 1st Tank Battalion crossed the creek and began systematic destruction of remaining enemy positions in the Coconut Grove. The tanks were armed with 37mm guns and coaxial machine guns, providing both direct fire capability against fortified positions and the mobility necessary to pursue fleeing enemy soldiers. Tank infantry coordination was primitive by later standards, with Marine riflemen providing close security while the armor engaged targets of opportunity throughout the plantation. The tank sweep continued until 1500 hours, by which time organized Japanese resistance had been completely eliminated. Final casualty counts indicated that the Ichiki detachment had been virtually annihilated, with fewer than 50 survivors escaping eastward toward their original landing site at Taivu Point. Marine casualties were significantly lighter, totaling 44 killed and 71 wounded, but the loss of experienced personnel like Rivers represented a serious degradation of unit combat effectiveness that would require replacement and retraining. The victory at Alligator Creek represented the first major defeat of Japanese ground forces by American troops in the Pacific War, proving that disciplined defensive tactics and superior firepower could overcome the fanatical courage and night attack methods that had characterized enemy operations throughout Southeast Asia and the Dutch East Indies. The successful defense of the Henderson Field perimeter ensured continued Allied control of the airfield, enabling the deployment of fighter and bomber squadrons that would prove decisive in subsequent operations throughout the Solomon Islands campaign. For Schmid, the immediate aftermath of the battle brought evacuation to a Navy hospital ship anchored in Iron Bottom Sound, where surgeons would attempt to save what remained of his vision and begin the long process of rehabilitation that would prepare him for life as a disabled veteran. His actions during the night of August 21st had earned him the Navy Cross and the lasting respect of his fellow Marines, but the personal cost would affect every aspect of his remaining life. The hospital ship USS Solace arrived off Guadalcanal on August 23, 1942, her white hull and red crosses providing a stark contrast to the gray warships that dominated Iron Bottom Sound. Schmid was transferred from the battalion aid station by landing craft, carried on a stretcher between rows of other wounded Marines who represented the growing cost of holding Henderson Field against increasingly desperate Japanese counterattacks. The ship's medical facilities were overwhelmed with casualties from the Tenaru battle and subsequent skirmishes, forcing Navy surgeons to perform triage operations that prioritize patients based on their likelihood of survival and return to duty. Commander Charles Patterson, the ship's chief surgeon, examined Schmid's injuries under optimal lighting conditions and confirmed Lieutenant Commander Morrison's initial assessment that the damage to both eyes was extensive and likely irreversible. Multiple fragments had penetrated the corneas and damaged the retinas beyond surgical repair, while additional injuries to the surrounding facial tissues would require several operations to restore normal appearance and function. Patterson's primary concern was preventing infection and minimizing scarring, goals that required immediate surgical intervention followed by extended hospitalization in a fully equipped medical facility. The surgery lasted 4 hours and 27 minutes, with Patterson and his surgical team working to remove accessible fragments and repair damaged tissue while preserving what remained of Schmid's vision. The procedure was complicated by the presence of coral particles that had been driven deep into the eye sockets by the force of the explosion, requiring careful extraction to prevent further damage to surrounding nerves and blood vessels. Despite the surgical team's best efforts, post-operative examinations confirmed that Schmid had lost sight in his left eye completely and retained only limited light perception in his right eye. Recovery aboard the hospital ship was slow and painful, with Schmid experiencing severe headaches, nausea, and disorientation as his body adapted to the loss of vision. Navy corpsmen provided round-the-clock care, administering pain medication, changing dressings, and assisting with basic functions that had become impossible without sight. The psychological impact of permanent blindness was as severe as the physical injuries, forcing Schmid to confront the reality that his life had been fundamentally changed by a single moment during the night battle at Alligator Creek. On September 15, 1942, Schmid was transferred to the Navy Hospital at Mare Island, California, where specialized facilities and personnel were available for the long-term treatment of combat injuries. The cross-country journey by hospital train took 5 days, during which medical personnel monitored his condition and provided care for other patients being evacuated from the Pacific Theater. The train carried 137 wounded servicemen, representing every branch of the armed forces and casualties from battles across the Pacific, from Wake Island to Guadalcanal. Mare Island Naval Hospital had been expanded rapidly since Pearl Harbor to accommodate the growing number of casualties from Pacific operations, with new wards and specialized treatment facilities added to handle the unique injuries produced by modern warfare. Schmid was assigned to Ward 7, which specialized in treating patients with severe eye injuries and blindness, under the care of Lieutenant Commander Helen Rodriguez, a Navy nurse who had developed innovative techniques for helping blind veterans adapt to their disabilities. The rehabilitation program at Mare Island was comprehensive, including physical therapy to strengthen his remaining capabilities, occupational therapy to learn new skills for daily living, and psychological counseling to address the emotional trauma of combat and disability. Schmid initially resisted many aspects of the program, particularly efforts to teach him mobility techniques and alternative methods for performing routine tasks. His frustration was compounded by letters from home that described the hero's welcome being prepared for his return to Philadelphia, celebrations that seemed inappropriate given his condition and the loss of his closest friends during the battle. Lieutenant Rodriguez recognized that Schmid's resistance to rehabilitation stemmed partly from survivor guilt, and partly from his belief that blindness made him useless as both a Marine and a civilian. She arranged for him to meet other patients who had successfully adapted to similar injuries, including Sergeant Michael Torres, who had lost both eyes during the Bataan campaign, but had learned to navigate independently and was preparing to return home to resume his career as a teacher. These encounters gradually convinced Schmid that blindness did not necessarily mean the end of a productive life. The formal award ceremony took place on February 18, 1943, at the Philadelphia Navy Yard, where Schmid received the Navy Cross from Rear Admiral Thomas Kincaid in front of an audience that included his parents, Ruth Hartley, and several hundred local dignitaries. The citation read by Admiral Kincaid described Schmid's actions during the night of August 21st, in terms that emphasized his courage and effectiveness despite his wounds, crediting him with killing over 200 enemy soldiers and contributing significantly to the successful defense of Henderson Field. The ceremony was followed by a parade through downtown Philadelphia, with Schmid riding in an open car alongside other local heroes, while thousands of citizens lined the streets to show their appreciation. The celebration was overwhelming for someone who had spent the previous 6 months in hospitals, and Schmid found the attention difficult to handle, given his belief that Rivers and the other Marines who had died deserved equal recognition. The disparity between public perception of his heroism and his own sense of loss created additional psychological burdens that would affect him for years. Ruth Hartley had waited throughout his hospitalization and recovery, visiting him regularly at Mare Island and corresponding daily when distance made visits impossible. Their wedding took place on June 12, 1943, in a small ceremony at St. Bartholomew's Church in Philadelphia, with Diamond serving as best man despite his own ongoing recovery from wounds received during the battle. The couple used the engagement ring Schmid had purchased with his enlistment bonus, creating a connection between his pre-war hopes and his post-war reality that helped provide continuity during a period of dramatic change. Employment opportunities for blind veterans in 1943 were limited, but Schmid eventually found work at a factory that manufactured precision instruments for the military, where his mechanical aptitude and attention to detail proved valuable despite his disability. The work was satisfying because it contributed directly to the war effort, allowing him to feel that he was still serving his country even though he could no longer fight. His wages were supplemented by a disability pension from the Veterans Administration, providing financial security that enabled him and Ruth to establish a modest household in the same Philadelphia neighborhood where he had grown up. The broader strategic impact of the Tenaroo battle became clear as the Guadalcanal campaign progressed, with Henderson Field serving as the base for air operations that gradually established Allied superiority throughout the Solomon Islands. The successful defense of the airfield perimeter on August 21st had preserved the foothold that enabled subsequent operations, including the eventual capture of Rabaul and the advance toward the Japanese home islands. Marine Corps historians would later identify the battle as the turning point where American forces proved they could defeat veteran Japanese troops in sustained ground combat. For the thousands of Marines who served on Guadalcanal after August 1942, the story of Schmid's stand became part of unit tradition, passed down through training and informal conversations as an example of courage under impossible circumstances. The specific details varied in the telling, but the essential message remained constant: that individual Marines could make decisive contributions to victory through determination and skill, even when wounded and facing overwhelming odds. This tradition helped sustain morale during the brutal fighting that characterized the Pacific War, providing inspiration when other motivations proved insufficient. Schmid's adaptation to civilian life was gradual and sometimes difficult, but he eventually found satisfaction in his work, his marriage, and his role as a symbol of Marine Corps valor. The blindness that had initially seemed like the end of his useful life became instead a testament to the human capacity for adaptation and the possibility of finding meaning and purpose despite severe physical limitations.